My name is Fabio. For 5 years, my world was a labyrinth of parchment and dust in the lower, less glamorous levels of the Vatican's secret archives. Don't be fooled by the secret name. Most of the work was tedious, cataloguing 19th century diocesan documents, restoring faded ecclesiastical maps, breathing the dry, still air that smelled of centuries of paper and silence. I was a small cog in a vast ancient machine, a junior archivist with limited access, tasked with organized oblivion. I liked the quiet, the order, the sense of touching history, but there are places, even within such a holy site, where the silence is too heavy and history whispers things that shouldn't be heard. My section was the Deposito Ausiliario Third, a subterranean level rarely visited by external researchers, containing mostly administrative records from defunct congregations and long reorganized dioceses. An endless sea of metal shelves under weak, constantly humming fluorescent lights. I almost always worked alone, my only regular contact being the level's custodian, Brother Lorenzo, an elderly, stooped man who moved with the slowness of someone, carrying the weight of many secrets, or perhaps just many years. It all started when I was assigned a particularly arduous task, verifying and updating the handwritten indexes for a section of 17th century documents slated for digitization. They were enormous volumes, bound in cracked leather, the pages yellowed and fragile. Meticulous work, line by line, comparing the old index with the actual contents of the archive boxes. It was in one of these index volumes, one covering the records of a small Benedictine monastery in Umbria that was suppressed in 1688 for administrative reasons, that I found the anomaly. Near the end of the index, after the expected entries, baptismal records, land deeds, monastic correspondence, there was an extra section. It had no title, and it was written in a different hand than the rest of the volume. It was tighter, almost frantic, using a darker, almost black ink. The entries listed there weren't normal documents. They were cryptic references: Lamentum Mororum, Lament of the Walls, Cell 12, Testimony Brother Antonio, Umbra Sub Sol, Shadow Under the Sun, Report Inquisitor M, Clavis Carnis, Appendix Nigra, Key of Flesh, See Black Appendix, Infans, Silenti, Sora Agnes, Child of Silence, Interrogation Sister Agnes, and so on, a dozen entries, each more bizarre and unsettling than the last. None of these references corresponded to any known document from that monastery or period. The Appendix Nigra, Black Appendix, was certainly not part of any official cataloguing system I knew. My first reaction was professional, a cataloguing error, perhaps lost or misfiled documents. But the different handwriting, the disturbing titles, something was wrong. I felt a chill run down my spine, an instinct telling me to close the book and forget about it. But curiosity, the archivist's curse, was stronger. I took the index to Brother Lorenzo. He was at his small desk at the end of the depository's main corridor, meticulously polishing an old wax seal. I showed him the anomalous section. He adjusted, his glasses on the bridge of his nose, took the heavy volume with his wrinkled hands, and examined the entries for a long moment. His usually placid face seemed to subtly tighten. "Interesting," he finally murmured, his voice lower than usual. He ran a finger over the dark script. A ghost index. It happens sometimes. Documents lost to time, references leading nowhere. "But these titles, brother," I insisted. "Lament of the Walls, Key of Flesh, and the Black Appendix." Brother Lorenzo closed the book abruptly. "Overzealousness of some old scribe, perhaps, or personal notes that shouldn't be here. Don't concern yourself with it, Fabio. Ignore this section. It's not within the scope of your verification task. Focus on the official records." He handed the book back to me, his eyes meeting mine for an instant. There was a silent warning there, an unspoken order not to dig deeper. I should have obeyed. Should have ignored the entries, finished my work and forgotten, but I couldn't. The words echoed in my mind. Umbra sub sol. Infans silenti. What horrors could have happened in that small monastery to generate such descriptions? And why? Would someone record it in an index, only for the documents to vanish? Over the next few days, I used my free time and the access I had to the internal search systems, limited but still useful, to look for any mention of these titles or the Appendix Nigra. I found absolutely nothing in the official catalogues. It was as if these references had never existed outside that handwritten index, but I found something else. I started to feel a subtle difference in Deposito Ausiliario III, a sense of weight. The silence seemed deeper, more expectant. The shadows in the distant corners of the stacks seemed darker, and sometimes I caught a fleeting impression of movement in my peripheral vision, a flicker passing quickly between shelves, gone when I turned. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to occasionally falter, creating seconds of near-total darkness before returning to normal. And I started feeling cold, a damp chill, like a crypt's, that seemed to concentrate in certain areas, especially near the section holding the supposedly non-existent files from the suppressed monastery. I began to suspect Brother Lorenzo knew more than he let on. I tried approaching him again, casually mentioning the strangeness of the titles. He cut me off gently but firmly. "Fabio, there are many sad and strange stories in the annals of the Church. Not all need revisiting. The past should remain buried. When it is disturbing, it is an act of mercy." His expression was unreadable. The feeling of being watched intensified. I felt it while working, while walking the silent corridors, even when I was at home in my small apartment near the Vatican. It was as if my curiosity about that index had triggered some kind of silent alarm, or awakened something that slumbered in the archives. One night, working late to make up for the time I'd lost researching, I was alone in the depository. Lorenzo had already left. The silence was absolute, save for the hum of the lights. I was in the Umbrian monastery section, checking a box of correspondence. I felt the cold intensify dramatically, and then I heard a sound that wasn't a whisper nor a flicker. It was the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. It came from somewhere amidst the tall, dark shelves. I froze. There was no way a baby could be down here on this subterranean restricted level. I called out hesitantly, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The crying stopped instantly. Absolute silence, but the cold persisted, and the sense of presence was overwhelming. I ran out of the depository. That night, leaving my work unfinished, Infant Silenti, the child of silence. The index entry echoed in my head. What did it mean? What had happened to a child in that monastery? And why was I hearing its cries centuries later in the Vatican archives? I couldn't ignore it anymore. The fear was great, but the need to know was greater. The next night I returned to the depository, determined. I knew it was risky, that I was disobeying direct orders and perhaps tampering with dangerous things. I took the index volume again and studied the forbidden section. Appendix Nigra. Where could it be? It wasn't an official system. Perhaps a physical location, a hidden section within that very archive area? I began examining the shelves of the monastery section more carefully. Checked the labels, the codes, everything seemed normal. But then I noticed something on one of the rearmost shelves, in a dark corner. Behind the regular archive boxes, there was a small empty space on the bottom shelf, almost hidden. And in that space sat a single volume bound in dark, untitled leather, which wasn't listed in any record I had ever seen. With trembling hands, I took the volume. It was heavy, cold to the touch. The pages were of a thick, dark parchment, almost like cured leather, and they were covered in the same tight, frantic script as the forbidden index. There was no title, no internal index. They were accounts, detailed, horrifying descriptions corresponding to the index titles. I read about the lament of the walls, the testimony of a friar who heard weeping and screams coming from the very stones of his cell. I read the report of Inquisitor M about a shadow under the sun, an entity or influence that seemed to feed on faith and light within the monastery, leaving a trail of despair and blasphemy. I read about blasphemous rituals detailed in the Key of Flesh, and finally I found the account of Sister Agnes's interrogation regarding the Child of Silence. It was the story of an infant born in secret within the monastery walls, a baby, who never cried, never made a sound, but whose eyes seemed to hold an ancient, terrible wisdom. The child was seen as an ill omen, an abomination. The account described how, in a night of desperation and superstitious fear, the child was silenced, permanently, walled up alive in one of the cells to contain the evil they believed it represented. Cell 12. The Lament of the Walls. It all clicked together in a horrifying way. I closed the book, nauseated, heart-pounding. This was the Appendix Nigra, an unofficial record of the horrors that led to the monastery's suppression. A record that should have been destroyed, but which someone, perhaps the index scribe himself, had hidden here in the depths of the archives. And the crying I heard. Suddenly, all the lights in the depository went out. Total darkness. The cold became almost unbearable, and the baby's cry began again, this time coming from all directions around me, echoing in the dark corridor, a sound of pure agony and loss. I dropped the book and stumbled through the darkness, using my hands to guide myself along the cold metal shelves. Behind me I sensed movement, a slow dragging on the floor, and the crying seemed to intensify, taking on an accusatory, almost angry tone. I didn't look back. I ran until I found the emergency exit, scrambled up the stairs blindly, and only stopped when I reached the brightly lit safety of a main corridor on an upper level. The next day, I was summoned to the archive administrator's office. Brother Lorenzo was there, his face sterner than ever. I was informed bluntly that my services were no longer required. There had been an internal restructuring. I was escorted out of the Vatican immediately, without even a chance to collect my personal belongings. No mention was made of the index, the black book, or the events of the previous night. I moved away from Rome. I tried to forget Deposito Ausiliario. 3. The Forbidden Index, the Appendix Nigra, the cries of the Child of Silence. But the knowledge stays with me. The feeling of having touched something profoundly wrong, a history of horror buried under layers of silence and ecclesiastical administration. And the fear that by reading those accounts, by hearing those cries, I connected myself to it. That the child's silence wasn't broken just for me that night, but that its lament now follows me, waiting for another chance to be heard in the darkness. And I wonder how many other black appendices exist, hidden in the depths of those infinite archives, guarding stories that should never see the light of day. Dr. Isabella Bianchi was one of the world's leading experts in fresco restoration, a master at bringing faded colors and lost details back to life. Her reputation earned her a prestigious commission, albeit shrouded in almost monastic discretion, to restore a little-known but supposedly magnificent fresco from the early 16th century, located in the chapel of St. Jerome the Penitent, a side chapel rarely open to the public within the labyrinthine walls of the Vatican. For Isabella, it was a chance to work in an unparalleled historical environment, even if the fresco's subject, described in preliminary documents as the martyrdom of St. Constance, wasn't particularly uplifting. The chapel itself was small, cold, and smelled of damp stone and old incense. Dim even during the day, light struggled to penetrate the high alabaster windows. Monsignor Vecchio, an elderly cleric with shrewd eyes and a smile that rarely seemed genuine, briefed her on the project. He emphasized the piece's historical importance and the need for swift, discreet work outside of regular visiting hours, mainly during the night when the chapel would be completely empty. The fresco covered almost the entire right side wall. It was a powerful work, though damaged by moisture and time. It depicted Saint Constance, surrounded by her Roman tormentors against a backdrop of decaying classical architecture. The composition was dramatic, the figures rendered with a brutal realism typical of the period. Isabella set up her scaffolding, her special lights, and began the meticulous work of cleaning and reintegrating the colors. From the beginning, something about the painting bothered her. It wasn't the violence of the martyrdom scene to which she was accustomed in religious art. It was a specific figure in the crowd watching the saint. A man standing in the shadows of an archway, slightly behind the other figures, partially obscured. While most onlookers in the fresco displayed horror, pity, or sadism, this man's face was blank. His eyes, though painted in detail, seemed veiled, devoid of any recognizable emotion. He simply observed the scene with a cold, detached intensity that felt out of place. And there was something about the way he was positioned, in the shadows, that made him seem both part of the crowd and separate from it, like an observer from another dimension. Isabella initially attributed this to the unknown artist's skill in creating psychological ambiguity. But the more she worked on the fresco, especially during the long, silent hours of the night, the more the figure in the shadows disturbed her. She began to get the uncomfortable feeling of being watched as she worked. She would turn around instinctively, expecting to see Monsignor Vecchio or a guard, but the chapel was always empty, save for the silent figures on the wall. The gaze seemed to come from the fresco itself, specifically from that veiled figure. Then the small anomalies began. One night, while retouching an area near the shadowy figure, she was certain the expression in the veiled eyes changed for a split second. The blankness seemed to give way to a flicker of knowing, malice. She blinked, blaming fatigue or a trick of light from her lamps. But it happened again a few nights later. She dropped a small brush from the scaffold. As she bent to pick it up, she glanced up and saw the veiled face in the fresco, bearing a faint, almost imperceptible mocking smirk on its painted lips. When she looked again, the smirk was gone, the blank expression restored. Isabella began to doubt her own sanity. Were the isolation, the long hours, the oppressive atmosphere of the chapel affecting her mind? She casually mentioned the strangeness of that specific figure to Monsignor Vecchio. The Monsignor frowned. Ah, yes, the silent watcher, as some call him. An enigmatic figure. Some scholars believe it's a self-portrait of the artist, others a symbolic representation of the world's indifference to suffering. Pay it no mind, Doctor. Concentrate on restoring the saint. His answer was too quick, almost rehearsed, and the name Silent Watcher sent a chill down Isabella's spine. So, others had noticed. She decided to research the history of the chapel and the fresco. In the main archives, she found little information beyond what she already knew, but by discreetly bribing a young archive assistant with access to more restricted levels, an act against her professionalism, but the need was great, she gained access to older, less organized records pertaining to the chapel. She found references to several previous restoration projects on the fresco over the centuries, and what she discovered chilled her to the bone. 2 previous restorers had abandoned the work abruptly, citing nervous afflictions or disturbing visions. A third, in the late 19th century, had been found dead in the chapel, having fallen from the scaffolding in circumstances described as accidental, although a marginal note in one report mentioned he had become obsessed with the figure in the shadows and spoke of eyes that move. There were also accounts of strange accidents or sudden illnesses befalling people who spent too much time alone in the chapel, especially during the night. Fear became a cold, constant companion beside Isabella as she worked. She tried to focus on other parts of the fresco, avoiding the area around the silent watcher. But her eyes were constantly drawn there. The figure seemed to dominate the composition, even from the shadows, and the feeling of being watched was now almost unbearable. She started having vivid nightmares. She was trapped inside the fresco, the crowd surrounding her and the silent watcher approaching slowly, the veiled eyes now glowing with a dark light. One particularly oppressive night, while working on St. Constance's robes, she felt an intense cold descend upon the chapel, stronger than ever before. Her work lights began to flicker erratically, and then she heard a sound that didn't come from outside, a low, sibilant whisper seeming to emanate from the fresco wall itself. She couldn't distinguish words. It was just a sound of malevolent intent, cold and ancient. Instinctively she looked at the silent watcher. Its painted eyes seemed to gleam in the failing light, and the blank mouth appeared to twist as if it were the source of the whisper. Isabella scrambled down the scaffolding hastily, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her tools. She fled the chapel, locking the door behind her, and ran through the silent Vatican corridors until she reached the relative safety of the small apartment provided for her. She knew she should abandon the project, should leave, like the others before her. But something held her back, a mix of professional pride, fear of repercussions for breaking her contract with the Vatican, and a terrible, morbid fascination with the entity that seemed to inhabit that fresco. What was it? A trapped spirit, a curse, a manifestation of something older and darker tied to that place? She decided she needed a different approach. Maybe restoration wasn't enough. Maybe something needed to be contained. She remembered ancient restoration techniques, involving applying protective layers or even covering certain areas deemed problematic or ill-omened in older works. It was ethically questionable by modern standards, but perhaps it was the only way. The next night she returned to the chapel, armed not only with her pigments and brushes, but also with a special mixture of insulating varnish she had prepared. An old recipe including certain minerals and resins known in alchemical texts for their protective or sealing properties. Her plan was to apply a subtle, almost invisible layer over the figure of the silent watcher, hoping it might somehow veil or contain its influence. It was a desperate attempt, based more on folklore than science, but she felt she had no other choice. She climbed the scaffold, heart pounding. The air in the chapel was heavy, expectant. The feeling of being watched was intense. Avoiding looking directly at the figure, she began carefully preparing the area around it. Then she took the small brush with the special varnish, took a deep breath, and began to apply it over the veiled eyes of the watcher. The instant the brush touched the painted surface of the eyes, the temperature in the chapel plummeted. An icy wind swept through the enclosed space, extinguishing the votive candles burning in a corner. Isabella's worklights flickered violently and died, plunging the chapel into near total darkness, broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through the alabaster windows. And the whispering returned, this time loud, angry, filling the chapel, seeming to come from all directions, but centered on the figure before her. Isabella screamed, backing away on the unstable scaffold. She stared in horror at the fresco. In the dim light, the figure of the silent watcher seemed to have detached from the wall. It was no longer flat. There was a depth there, a three-dimensional shadow projecting outwards from the painted background. The veiled eyes were now pits of darkness that seemed to pull in the little remaining light. And a painted hand, the one hidden in the shadows of the figure's cloak, was moving slowly, reaching out from the fresco towards her. Panic gave Isabella strength. She fumbled her way down the scaffold, nearly falling. She ran to the door, but it wouldn't open. It was stuck or locked from the outside. She was trapped in there with it. She turned back against the cold door as the shadowy figure continued to emerge slowly from the wall, the angry whispering enveloping her. In an act of pure desperation, she remembered a small silver crucifix she always carried in her purse out of habit, a gift from her grandmother. She fumbled for it, hands shaking. She wasn't particularly religious, but in that moment she clung to anything. She held the crucifix aloft towards the figure, which was now almost completely out of the fresco, hovering in the chapel's cold air. "In the name of God," she started to say, her voice choked with terror. The reaction was instantaneous. The figure hissed, a sound of pure hatred and pain, and recoiled violently as if burned. It dissolved back into the wall, into the painted surface. The cold lessened. The whispers ceased. Isabella's work lights flickered and came back on, illuminating the silent chapel. The door behind her clicked softly open. She didn't wait. She ran through the corridors, ran out of the Vatican walls, and didn't stop until she was safe in her hotel room across the city. She left everything behind. Her equipment, her notes, the unfinished work. The next day, she received a laconic communication from Monsignor Vecchio's office stating that due to unforeseen circumstances, the restoration project was suspended indefinitely and her services were no longer required. No explanation was given. No questions were asked about her abrupt departure. Isabella left Rome immediately. She returned to her life, but the experience left her permanently scarred. She never knew what the entity in the fresco was, nor why it was trapped there, nor what the Vatican officials truly knew about it. But she knew it was ancient, malevolent, and that the restoration had perhaps been awakening or strengthening it. Years later, she heard from a colleague that the chapel of St. Jerome the Penitent had been permanently closed and sealed, citing structural instability. No one else would enter there. The fresco and its silent watcher were left in darkness. Isabella wondered if her desperate attempt with the varnish and crucifix had worked, if the entity had been contained, or if it was merely dormant again, waiting behind the sealed walls for another unsuspecting soul to find it, or for time to wear away the layers of paint and varnish, freeing the veiled eyes to watch the world once more. My name is Matteo. Joining the Pontifical Swiss Guard was the greatest honor of my life. Coming from a small village in the Alps, serving at the heart of the Catholic Church, protecting the Holy Father, felt like an almost divine calling. The discipline was strict, the training exhaustive, but I was prepared for that. What I wasn't prepared for was the weight of history that permeates every stone of the Vatican, and for the shadows that seem to gather in the oldest, quietest corners of this sacred place, especially during the long hours of the night watch. Our barracks are near St. Anne's Gate, incorporating parts of the ancient Leonine Wall, built in the 9th century to defend St. Peter's Basilica. It's a place of contrasts, the modernity of our equipment against the immemorial age of the stones. My initial training was intense, focused on security, protocol, combat. But there was also an unspoken subtext, an emphasis on constant vigilance that went beyond simple protection against human threats. Keep your eyes open, but more importantly, keep your mind focused, our instructor, Sergeant Meyer, would say, an austere man whose gaze seemed to carry the weight of generations of guards. This place is old, and the night holds more than just darkness. My first night watch duty was a surreal experience. The Vatican at night is a different place. Vast, silent, almost ghostly under the moonlight, and strategically placed security lamps. Patrolling the empty corridors, the silent courtyards, the dark gardens, was like walking through a historical dream. But there was also a tension in the air, a feeling of being watched that I initially attributed to beginners' nerves. It was during a patrol in the area adjacent to our barracks, near a particularly old and dimly lit section of the Leonine Wall incorporated into the structure, that, I began to feel something more specific, a coldness that wasn't just from the ancient stone, a stillness that seemed to absorb the sound of my own footsteps, and a distinct, irrational feeling that something was on the other side of that massive wall. Not something physical, but a presence, attention, waiting. I mentioned this casually to a more experienced guard, a fellow named Lucas. He shrugged, but his eyes flickered for an instant. "Ah, the old wall," he said, forcing a smile. "It has its stories. They say it listens and remembers. Just ignore it. Focus on your rounds." But the way he avoided my gaze afterward told me there was more he wasn't admitting. The nights passed. The feeling near the old wall persisted. Sometimes in the deep quiet around 3 a.m., I thought I heard very low whispers, like the rustle of silk or shallow breathing coming from the direction of the wall. Other times I'd see shadows move in my peripheral vision in that area, only to vanish when I looked directly. I tried to convince myself it was fatigue, suggestion, the stories Lucas had mentioned. Then, one night, during a particularly violent thunderstorm raging over Rome, I was on internal duty in the barracks. Due to the storm, external rounds were reduced. Around 3:15 a.m., I needed to go to the armory, located on a lower level, accessed by a corridor that ran directly alongside the exposed foundation of that section of the Leonine wall. The lighting there was minimal, just dim emergency lights. As I walked down the damp, cold corridor, I heard a sound ahead. A sound of scraping, slow and deliberate, like stone being scratched by something hard. I stopped, alert. I cautiously approached the turn in the corridor where the sound seemed to originate. I peeked around. What I saw froze me. Sergeant Meyer was there, alone. His back was to me, facing the old damp wall of the Leonine wall. In his hand, he held something that gleamed faintly in the emergency light. It looked like a piece of polished metal, or perhaps obsidian, and he was using it to slowly trace a complex symbol onto the damp stone surface. It wasn't a Christian symbol, I recognized. It was angular, with lines intersecting in strange, almost aggressive ways. As he traced, he muttered continuously under his breath, words I couldn't distinguish, but the tone was intense, almost feverish. He didn't look like he was praying. He looked like he was performing a spell or a ritual of containment. There was a desperate tension in his posture, a rigidity in his shoulders. He finished the symbol, stepped back, and then did something even stranger. He brought his free. Hand to his mouth, bit his own finger hard. I saw his body flinch with the effort, and then pressed the bleeding finger into the center of the symbol he had traced on the wall. I stood horrified and fascinated, unable to move or make a sound. What the hell was he doing? Why the symbol? Why the blood? Was this part of some secret guard protocol? An unwritten tradition, or something personal, a manifestation of the pressure the place exerted on him? Sergeant Meyer stood there for a long moment, head bowed, breathing heavily. Then he straightened, up, wiped the finger on his uniform pants as if nothing had happened, pocketed the sharp object, and turned around. His eyes met mine in the dim light. For an instant, I saw raw panic in his face, but it was replaced almost immediately by his usual mask of austere authority. His eyes were cold, hard as steel. He said nothing, just stared at me for a moment. That felt like an eternity, a look that was both a warning and an assessment. Then he walked past me without a word and headed up the corridor, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, trembling, staring at the damp wall. The symbol was there, faintly visible, glistening slightly where the fresh blood touched it. The smell of ozone and wet stone seemed stronger there. The sense of presence on the other side of the wall was almost unbearable now, a silent, ancient pressure. I got out of there as fast as I could, completely forgetting what I had gone to the armory for. I returned to my bunk but couldn't sleep. The images of Sergeant Meyer, the symbol, the blood, his stare, replayed in my mind. This wasn't normal. It wasn't just history or the weight of the place. There was something else, something that required silent rituals and blood sacrifices in the middle of the night, performed by the men sworn to protect the heart of the church. What were they really protecting? Or rather, what were they protecting themselves from? The next day, I acted as if nothing had happened. Sergeant Meyer did too. Our interactions returned to their usual formality, but I sometimes felt his gaze on me, heavy and calculating. I avoided the lower corridor and the old wall as much as possible, but the sense of presence, the heavy stillness, the occasional whispers on the edge of hearing, they didn't disappear. If anything, they seemed to have intensified since I witnessed the ritual. It was as if, by seeing, I had also become part of whatever was happening there. Months passed. I became a more experienced, more hardened guard. I learned to ignore the feeling near the wall, to rationalize the whispers as wind, the shadows as tricks of light. I almost convinced myself that what I saw with Sergeant Meyer was an aberration, perhaps a moment of personal weakness or superstition on his part, until one night, months later. I was again on night watch, patrolling alone near that same section of the leonine wall. The night was still, the moon new, the darkness near total. I felt the familiar chill, the pressure in the air, and I felt something else, an impulse, an almost unconscious compulsion. My hand moved on its own towards the cold, damp wall. My fingers traced the rough stone, and before I fully realized what I was doing, I was muttering words under my breath, words I didn't recognize, but which felt strangely right in that moment, in that place. I felt a sharp, sudden urge to mark the stone, to leave a sign, to appease the silent pressure emanating from it. I realized what I was doing and snatched my hand back as if the stone had burned me. I looked at my own fingers, horrified. What was that? Why did I feel that urge? Was it the influence of the place, stress? Or was it something more, something that Sergeant Meyer's ritual and my witnessing of it had awakened in me? I had no answers. Only a cold, deep fear that settled in my chest and never really left. I continued my service in the Swiss Guard, performed my duties with discipline. But something had changed. The unwavering faith, the pure idealism, had been eroded by doubt and a disturbing knowledge. I still protected the Vatican, but now I understood the protection wasn't just against external threats. There was something within the walls, something ancient and slumbering in the very stone that required a constant, silent and perhaps terrible vigil. And the most frightening part was the growing feeling that by being part of this vigil, I was also being watched, and perhaps slowly changed by the very thing I was sworn to contain. So what did you think of this chilling descent into the dark corridors and buried secrets of the Vatican? Did these stories make you believe places of such history and power can hold dark energies or entities? What other mysteries do you think the Vatican hides? If this narrative compilation left you feeling uneasy and pondering what truly lies behind closed doors and ancient texts, please show your support by hitting the like button. It truly helps bring more tales from the hidden depths to the channel. Have a theory about Vatican secrets, a local story you've heard? Share it in the comments below. Every voice adds a piece to the puzzle. And most importantly, if you crave more dark and unsettling narratives, exploring the terror hiding in the most unexpected and sacred places, subscribe to the Hear This Fear channel and turn on notifications. After all, some prayers may never be answered, or perhaps they are answered by something that shouldn't be listening.